Have you ever wondered about the paradox that is central to our Rosh Hashanah liturgy? On the one hand, today is the first day of the new year, a day of new beginnings. Apples and honey, round challah, Shana Tova. It is sweet and celebratory this year in particular, as we are back in person for the first time since 2019. That is indeed something to celebrate. On the other hand, Rosh Hashanah is called Yom Hadin, the day of judgment, and the Unatan Tokef, the central piece of liturgy around which our entire morning revolves, is dark and disturbing. Who will live and who will die? The text asks us year after year. Who will die by flood? Who by suicide? Who by hunger? Who by fire? Whose name will be written in the book of life and whose, God forbid, will not? Even the angels are being judged today. The angels, who are perfect. Umalachim yechafezun, the text says. The angels are trembling. If they are afraid, then we should be absolutely terrified. So what exactly are we supposed to feel today? Is it sweet or salty? A statement of hope or a dire warning? How are we supposed to find comfort in that ambiguity? It is perhaps for that very reason that I have always been a Yom Kippur kind of girl. Rabbi Asher and I used to joke about how he was more Rosh Hashanah, sweet, hopeful, and I was his achy cantorial counterpart on the other side of the bima. A little bit of country, a little bit of rock and roll. We were a good match. But really, Yom Kippur has always just made more sense to me. We dedicate 24 hours to going as deep and dark as we need to in order to reemerge into the light at the end. We don't just talk about hunger and thirst, we feel it. And through the intensity of the deprivation and the litany of the prayers, Ashamnu, Bagadnu, we find ourselves so raw and open that healing can begin. Forget the mix and match of Rosh Hashanah, thank you very much. Let me sink into Yom Kippur and really see what I meant to find. The problem with this kind of thinking, with being most comfortable when life is all joy or all sorrow, all ecstasy or all grief, is that life, of course, is not like that. At moments, sure, you're riding the high and it feels pure and free and unbeatable feeling. But then you inevitably crash and find yourself wading in a sea of blue longing, wanting to get back to the top of the ride. It's not a very sustainable way to live. Plus, I'm sure rabbis aren't supposed to play holiday favorites. So, friends, this sermon is my attempt to make nice with Rosh Hashanah. Let's see what this paradoxical holiday has to teach us about our own complex lives. Let's begin with the texts that are central to our morning, the Torah and Haftarah readings for today. Our Torah reading this morning, the story of the Akedah, or the binding of Isaac, has always baffled me for the same reason that I don't understand apples and honey being matched with existential questions of life and death. Why do we read about Abraham nearly killing his son Isaac on a day about new beginnings? Why is this our origin story? It's a familiar story, of course. God asks Abraham to take his son Isaac, who is a grown man, and walk him to the top of a mountain to be sacrificed. At the moment that the sacrifice is about to happen, Abraham looked up, the Torah tells us. We'll hear it in just a few moments. And his eye fell upon a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering in place of his son. By virtue of a miracle, the great moment of murder and devastation is transformed into a moment of grace. The ram is offered instead. But what about Sarah, Isaac's mother, the silent character in this story? We read in Vayikra Rabbah, a book of homiletic midrash from the 5th century, the following imagined conversation between mother and son. You should know it is so, that Isaac went back to his mother, and she said to him, "Where were you, my son?" And he said to her, "My father took me and raised me up mountains and lowered me down hills." She said, "Oi, my son, if it hadn't been for the angel, you would have been slaughtered." And he said, "Yes." At that moment, she cried 6 cries corresponding to the 6 tikiyot, the blasts. They said she wasn't able to finish the thing before she died. And to this day, we blow the shofar, a ram's horn, to remind us not only of this moment of divine intervention, but also of the grief from which it was born. And what about our haftarah? In 1 Samuel, we'll read about Hannah, married to Elkanah, who has 2 wives. His other wife, Peninnah, has children, but Hannah is barren and cannot conceive. She is devastated at her inability to have children. And despite her husband's pleas, "Am I not more devoted to you than 10 sons?" he says. She goes to the Beit HaMikdash, to the temple, to pray and plead her case. She is so distraught that she seems drunk to Eli the priest, who chastises her for showing up in such a state to the temple. But she explains, "Oh no, my lord, I am a very unhappy woman. I have drunk no wine or other strong drink, but I have been pouring out my heart to the Eternal. Do not take your maidservant for a worthless woman. I have only been speaking all this time out of my great anguish and distress." And because of her honest plea and her desperate longing, God remembers her, and she is rewarded not only with a child, but with Shmuel, with Samuel, a prophet. If we look solely to our biblical passages of the day, it would seem that our tradition is asking us to consider that redemption comes out of struggle, to imagine that our suffering is not in vain, that it has purpose, and that the point of life is not to imagine a time when we will be purely happy, but to accept that suffering, even profound suffering, like being barren when you desperately want a child, or being asked to sacrifice the child of your old age who arrived after nearly a century of childlessness, to accept that even this level of suffering can be redeemed. Our biblical texts for this day seem to be clearly saying that redemption does not blossom out of joy or sorrow, but out of the mix of the two. Shmuel was born of Hannah's suffering, born of her strife, not despite it. The shofar call is our wailing souls, crying out despair, crying out relief, which begs the question, must we suffer in order for life to be meaningful? Or can we at least make meaning out of our suffering? Not surprisingly, our Talmudic sages have also been wrestling with these questions for millennia in their own Talmudic way. In Ketubot 17a, it is written that when both a kala, a bride, and her wedding procession, and a mate, a deceased person, and his funeral procession are going to cross paths, the funeral procession must defer to the wedding procession. And the deceased person is diverted to another route to avoid mingling the two groups. Explained best by the 11th century sage Rashi, when the bride comes out from her father's home to the wedding hall at the same time as those accompanying a dead body for burial, and both groups will be shouting, one group with joy and the other in mourning, and we don't want to mix the two, we reroute those accompanying the deceased. The question the sages are asking is, what do we do when joy and sorrow mix? Their answer? The mourners have to make room for people celebrating. The rabbis want us to privilege joy over sadness. But I take issue with this line of reasoning, not only because it goes against the structure of our liturgy, but also because it contradicts my own lived experience. How many of us have attended a funeral, even a tragic one, and laughed, sometimes heartily, during the ceremony? We had that very experience in our own community during our dear friend Harvey Hockhauser's funeral just recently. The grief was so palpable in the room, but Harvey was funny and a jokester, so we had to laugh to honor him as well. Or conversely, how many of us have attended weddings, our own or other people's, that are not pure 100% joy? All of us. Because even the structure of the Jewish wedding ceremony folds brokenness into it by smashing a glass at the end. Historically, we even held weddings in cemeteries during a plague. Schwarze Chasanas, black weddings, were believed to have been used to appeal to God's mercy when everything else has failed. So, what were the rabbis saying when they said that joy should win over sorrow? Because they couldn't possibly have meant it. How do we lean into elevating joy as we live through a time of unprecedented instability in the world? Between the devastating climate crisis that has the planet heating and glaciers melting at a frightening pace, reproductive rights being taken away from women across the country, which disproportionately affects Black and brown women, a staggering mental health crisis among teenagers that is sowing fear and concern in families throughout the world, religious institutions struggling to maintain members, despite the fact that what people need more than ever is faith and community, rising food and gas prices and growing food insecurity across the land, and not to mention an entire international human family trying to recover from a pandemic. How, given the state of the world, is this teaching about privileging joy comforting? Maybe what our sages meant when understanding the sacred moment when joy intersects with grief is that we must invite the sorrow to inform our joy, to allow the two to learn and lean on each other. As Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen says, the way we deal with loss shapes our capacity to be present to life more than anything else. When joy and sorrow mix, your instinct might be to let the grief take over completely, to dissolve into it and let no light in. So in order to avoid that human instinct, let the joy walk first. Allow it to take your hand and to guide you. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah, we say when someone has died. Exalted and glorified is your name, Eternal One. Maybe what the rabbis were saying was, always keep joy and praise in your heart, even on your darkest days. Which brings us right back to Rosh Hashanah. This day, Rosh Hashanah, that weaves together the day of judgment and the birthday of the world, barrenness and new beginnings, has at its foundation the concept of yir'ah, a word that's hard to translate because we don't have exactly the same word in English. Conventionally translated as fear, yir'ah has a much more nuanced meaning than simple anxiety or fright. In his essay Between Fear and Awe, Rabbi Shai Held describes it this way. Something described as norah, for example, can be either terror-instilling or awe-inspiring. Accordingly, yirah can convey the sense of fear on the one hand or of awe on the other. Yirah implies then standing before something much bigger than yourself, whether God or nature or these high holy days, and understanding our place in the order of things. In her book, Phosphorescence, a memoir of finding joy when your world goes dark, author Julia Baird describes awe this way. Studies have shown that awe can make us more patient and less irritable, more humble, more curious and creative. Research conducted by social psychologist Paul Piff and his colleagues suggests that people who regularly feel awe are more likely to be generous, helpful, altruistic, ethical, and relaxed. In one case, people who spent time staring up at towering eucalypts were more inclined to help someone who had stumbled and dropped a handful of pens than those who had not. In other words, when dwarfed by an experience, we are more likely to look to one another and care for one another and feel more connected. Baird's memoir beautifully describes her battle with both heartbreak and cancer, and the crucial role that swimming in the open ocean at sunrise played in her ability to keep living. She did not choose a swimming pool or a gentle walk on the beach, but the cold, unpredictable, gorgeous, terrifying, luminous, awe-inspiring ocean to bring her back to herself. So, what cultivates more awe? The single-minded focus of Yom Kippur that my soul craves? Or the confusing combination of joy and sorrow that Rosh Hashanah has to offer us? And this is where I have to admit that perhaps, only sometimes, the places where I am most comfortable, like dark and stormy Yom Kippur, are not necessarily the place where the greatest growth happens. Rosh Hashanah's contradictions make me uncomfortable, and that is exactly the discomfort that should be my signal that something deeper is going on, that some learning is calling to me. I don't know how I could have missed it, given that our own sacred music is an exquisite expression of aching, a perfect blend of longing and ecstasy, or stabs of joy, as Susan Cain calls it in Bittersweet. Or even given my own paradoxical theology, which somehow marries the belief that God is not up above controlling the world, and that God simultaneously has a guiding hand in our lives. It's the mystery of faith. In fact, the reason I love Yom Kippur is ultimately because of Ne'ilah at the end, the absolute rush I feel when it is clear that forgiveness has in fact been granted, that suffering has given birth to surrender. And that is what Rosh Hashanah has been saying all along. It's as if this day is saying, what happens today, B'Yom Hadin, on the day of judgment, will happen on steroids in 10 days, B'Yom Harachamim, on the day of mercy. Because there is no life, no transformation, no growth without discomfort and contradiction. There is no release without restriction. And there is no surviving the storms of life without remembering joy as often as we can and surrendering to awe as if our life depends on it. Because in fact, it does. Gemar Chatima Tova, friends. We are breaking into wholeness together.